In 1890, a farmer named Benjamin Milner bought a Hawkeye stump puller for $85, nearly half his annual income. His neighbors in Barron County, Wisconsin called it a fool's purchase. Milner had 43 acres of white pine stumps sitting in his fields, stumps so massive and so deeply rooted that no team of oxen could budge them. By October of that year, every stump was gone. The machine paid for itself before the first frost, and Milner's neighbors lined up to borrow it. I've been reading the old farm journals from the cutover country of northern Wisconsin, and I keep coming back to Milner. He wasn't famous, he never held office, he didn't invent anything. But I found his name in the Barron County tax rolls for 1889, and again in 1891, and the land value between those 2 years more than doubled. That doubling is the whole story of this video, because land with stumps on it wasn't really farmland. It was a promise you couldn't keep until you got the stumps out. If you care about the men who cleared this country with their hands, the ones nobody put on a stamp, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Everything we do here is about the forgotten work, the forgotten names, the forgotten machines. Stick with me, because what Milner did in one season on one farm, I still can't quite believe, and I've spent weeks on his story. Benjamin Milner was 37 years old in the spring of 1890. Born in 1853 in a small town called Stillwater in eastern Pennsylvania, where his father ran a tannery that failed in the Panic of 1873. Milner went west with his mother and his younger sister Clara after his father died of typhus. He worked as a hired hand on a dairy farm in Ohio for 6 years. He saved $600 in a tin box under a floorboard. In 1882, he married a schoolteacher named Mary Elizabeth Hovland, a tall Norwegian woman who read Longfellow aloud at night. They moved to Barron County, Wisconsin in 1885 because the government was selling cutover pine land for $2.50 an acre. Cutover land. That's the phrase you need to hold on to. Because Milner didn't buy a forest. The forest had already been cut. The big white pine had gone down the river to the Chippewa mills 20 years earlier. What was left was stumps. Thousands of them. Pine stumps, 4 and 5 feet across at the base, with tap roots that went down 8 feet into the sandy loam, and lateral roots that spread out 15 feet in every direction, like the bones of some drowned creature. The loggers took the trees. They left the stumps. They left them because nobody in 1870 knew how to get them out. You could burn them, but a green pine stump doesn't burn. It just smolders. You could wait, but a white pine stump, full of pitch, can sit in the Wisconsin ground for 20 years and more without rotting. Milner's father-in-law had told him the story of a stump in Eau Claire County that was cut in 1858 and was still there, solid as a church pew, in 1898. 40 years, not rotted, not budging. And that was the problem that sat on every farm in the cutover. Milner's 80 acres had about 60 acres of pine stumps on it. He could plow between them. He could plant oats or buckwheat in little crooked rows that dodged around each one. But he could not turn that land into a proper field. Not with stumps every 30 feet. Not with roots you hit every time the plowshare bit deeper than 4 inches. For 5 years, Milner farmed around them. In 1886, he tried burning the stumps with piles of slash and tar. The stumps charred and kept standing. In 1887, he tried chopping one out with an axe and a mattock, just one, to see. It took him 9 days of daylight labor, and when it finally came loose, he was so exhausted he couldn't lift his arms to milk the cow that evening. 9 days for one stump. He had 2,000 stumps on his land. Do the arithmetic. 9 days times 2,000. That's 50 years of work for one man. Milner was not going to live 50 years more. In 1888, he tried oxen. He borrowed a team from a neighbor named Gustav Peterson, hooked a log chain around a medium-sized stump, and drove the oxen against it. The chain snapped. He replaced it with a heavier chain. The second chain held, and the oxen pulled until one of them fell to its knees and stayed there, breathing hard, foam on its muzzle. The stump had not moved, not 1 inch. Peterson took his oxen home and refused to lend them again. You don't kill an ox for a stump. So by the spring of 1890, Milner was desperate. Mary was pregnant with their third child. The mortgage on the land was due in October. The buckwheat crop in the little dodging rows had been poor. He went to the county seat in Barron for the Saturday market and stood in front of the general store reading a newspaper advertisement nailed to the wall. It showed a drawing of a machine, a low iron frame, a vertical capstan in the middle, like the capstan on a sailing ship, a long sweep arm that a horse could walk in a circle around, chains running out from the capstan to distant stumps. And at the top of the advertisement, in heavy black letters, the Hawkeye stump puller, patented, sold by K.B. Judson, Burlington, Iowa. $85, plus freight. Milner read that advertisement 3 times. He folded the newspaper. He walked back into the store, and he asked the clerk to write out a money order for $85 and change. He drained the tin box. He mortgaged the mare. He sent the money to Burlington, Iowa on a Monday morning in April. Before I tell you what happened when the Hawkeye arrived on the freight wagon from the Chippewa Falls depot, let me tell you how the thing actually worked. Because the engineering is the part that still makes me shake my head. It's not complicated. That's what's so wild about it. A village blacksmith could understand it in 5 minutes. But the mechanical advantage it produced, from a single horse walking in a circle, is honestly one of the quiet miracles of the 19th century. A Hawkeye stump puller was a capstan, that's the heart of it. A vertical iron drum about 3 feet tall, mounted on a heavy cast iron frame that you anchored to the ground with pins driven deep into the soil, usually against a so-called dead man stump that you'd use for leverage. On top of the capstan was a horizontal gear ring with teeth. Meshing into that gear ring, driven by a long wooden sweep arm about 12 feet long, was a small pinion gear. You hitched a single horse to the end of the sweep arm. The horse walked in a circle around the capstan. Here's the trick. The ratio between the big gear on the capstan and the little pinion gear on the sweep arm was something like 40-to-1. So the horse, walking at a comfortable 2 miles an hour at the end of a 12-foot sweep arm, turned the capstan very slowly but with enormous force. A heavy steel cable, sometimes a chain, was wrapped around the capstan. The other end of that cable was fixed to the stump. As the horse walked, the capstan wound the cable, and the cable pulled on the stump. The mechanical advantage was somewhere between 50 and 100 tons of pulling force. 1 horse, 1 wheel. Let me say that again so it lands. 1 horse, walking in a slow circle around an iron drum, generated more pulling force than 100 oxen could produce in a straight line. Because the oxen pull for a second, the capstan pulls forever. It never tires. It never slips. It just keeps winding, slow as a shadow moving across a kitchen floor, until the stump either comes up or the chain snaps. And the stumps came up. That's the thing. They came up root ball and all. Pine stumps 6 feet across, with tap roots 8 feet deep, came up out of the Wisconsin ground like rotten teeth, leaving a crater in the field that you could fill with a team and a scraper in an hour. A skilled operator with a good horse and a dry day could pull 30 to 40 stumps in a 10-hour working day. 30 stumps a day. Remember what Milner faced. 2,000 stumps. At 30 a day, that's 66 working days, 2 months and change. One man, one horse, one machine. A job that would have taken him, by hand, 50 years. That's the compression of human labor I can't get out of my head. 50 years of axe work, squeezed down into one summer, because a man in Burlington, Iowa, had figured out how to put a gear ratio between a horse and a pine stump. The man who figured that out, or at least patented the design that became the Hawkeye, was K.B. Judson. I don't have a first name for him in the records I found, just the initials. But Judson ran a small ironworks in Burlington, Iowa from about 1871 into the 1890s. He had been a blacksmith in Illinois before the Civil War, drafted into an Iowa regiment, came home with a shattered hip and a limp, and set up a shop on the Mississippi waterfront. He wasn't the first man to try a capstan-style stump puller. An earlier inventor named John Milburn had patented a similar mechanism in 1869. But Judson's version was lighter, cheaper to cast, and designed to be shipped on a single freight wagon. By 1885, the Hawkeye was the standard stump puller in the American Midwest. By 1895, there were competitors: the Monarch out of Iowa City, the Smith Grubber out of La Crescent, Minnesota, the Kirsten out of Escanaba, Michigan. But the Hawkeye came first, and it was the one Milner ordered. The freight wagon arrived at Milner's place on the 3rd of May, 1890. I have the date because Milner wrote it in the margin of the family Bible, along with the weather, which was cold and bright. The machine came in 3 crates. Total shipping weight just over 900 pounds. Milner and his neighbor Gustav Peterson, the one who had lent the oxen 2 years before and refused to do it again, unloaded the crates and stood looking at the parts scattered on the grass. Peterson said, in Norwegian, that it looked like an organ that had lost its mind. It took Milner 4 days to assemble it, mostly because the instruction sheet was printed small and in a dialect of English that a Pennsylvania Dutch farmer didn't always recognize. On the 5th day, with Mary holding the baby on the porch and Clara watching from the fence, Milner hitched the family mare, a patient old bay named Nellie, to the sweep arm. He ran the cable out 40 feet to the first stump, a 3-foot pine that had been sitting in his oat field since 1869. He slapped Nellie on the flank. She started to walk. The cable went taut. The capstan creaked. Nellie leaned into her collar and walked her first slow circle. The stump shivered. Dirt cracked around the base. On the second circle, the stump heaved, tilted, and on the third circle, it came up out of the ground in one piece, roots and clay and a small nest of ants, and toppled sideways into the oat stubble. Milner stood there for a minute. Then he sat down on the stump and he cried. Mary came off the porch and sat next to him and put her hand on his shoulder. He got up after a while and he pulled the next stump, and the next one after that. Between the 8th of May and the 17th of October, 1890, Benjamin Milner pulled 1,847 stumps out of 43 acres of his land. I have the numbers from a ledger he kept in the same drawer as his tax receipts. He worked 6 days a week, rested on Sundays because Mary would not allow work on the Sabbath, and he averaged 27 stumps on a full working day. He broke 3 cables. He replaced the pinion gear once when a tooth sheared off on a particularly stubborn red oak stump that had hidden itself under a pile of old slash. He lost half a day in June when Nellie threw a shoe and he had to walk her 4 miles into town to the blacksmith. And here's the part that starts the ripple. By the middle of June, his neighbors were coming to watch. Gustav Peterson came first, stood at the fence for an hour, didn't say anything, walked home, came back the next morning with his own horse, and asked if he could borrow the machine for the weekend. Milner said yes. Peterson cleared 11 stumps that Saturday and Sunday from his own back 40. On the next Monday, he brought Milner a smoked ham and 2 dozen eggs. Word moved. By July, a Norwegian farmer down the road named Ole Knutsen came asking. Knutsen had 18 acres of stumps he had been fighting with fire and axe for 7 years. Milner rented him the machine for 50 cents a day, plus the cost of any broken cables. Knutsen cleared all 18 acres by the end of August, pulled 740 stumps, and wrote Milner a note in Norwegian that Mary translated over supper. The note said, in essence, that Knutsen's oldest boy could now ride a horse across the back field in a straight line for the first time in Knutsen's life, and that the boy had done it 3 times that morning just to feel what it was like. If you've stayed with me this far, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button. This channel lives or dies on subscribers, and the algorithm buries stories like this one unless you tell it you want more. So tell it, 1 click. Then come back, because I have not gotten to the part that still, honestly, breaks my heart. Because the Hawkeye and the machines like it, the Monarch and the Smith and the Kirsten, cleared an astonishing amount of American land between 1870 and 1920. I have not found a single clean number for the total acreage, but the best estimates I could cross-reference from the Wisconsin Agricultural Reports, the Michigan State Agricultural College Bulletins, and a 1908 USDA circular on land clearing put the figure somewhere between 40 and 60 million acres. That's most of the upper Midwest. That's northern Wisconsin, the thumb of Michigan, eastern Minnesota, chunks of northern New York and Pennsylvania and West Virginia. The cutover country. The country the loggers left behind and the farmers inherited. Every one of those acres started as a cutover. Every one of them had stumps on it that nobody could move. And almost every one of them was cleared by a man like Milner or Peterson or Knutsen, working a Hawkeye or a Monarch behind a single patient horse, 1 stump at a time, for a summer or 2 or 3. Day to day, on a stump-pulling farm, the work went like this. You were up at 4:30 in the morning. You milked the cows, fed the chickens, hauled water from the well. You ate a breakfast Mary had cooked on a wood stove. Oatmeal, salt pork, coffee so strong it stood up by itself. By 6, you were out in the field with the horse and the Hawkeye. You'd already marked the stumps you meant to pull that day with a red rag tied to a stick, usually the night before. You set the machine first. That was the slow part. You anchored the frame to a dead man stump, something big and rotten that you weren't going to pull, just use for leverage. You drove iron pins into the ground. You ran the cable out, usually 50 or 60 feet, to the stump you meant to take. You wrapped the cable around the base of the stump and locked it with a clevis. You checked the pinion gear. You checked Nellie's harness. You checked the sweep arm. And then you slapped the horse on the flank, and she started her circle, and the capstan started to turn. Most stumps came in 6 or 8 revolutions of the capstan. A big stubborn one might take 20. When the stump came up, you unclipped the cable, you led Nellie over to the next marked stump, you reset the anchor, you ran the cable out, and you started again. Noon, you ate bread and cheese in the shade. 4 in the afternoon, you stopped to water Nellie and wipe her down. 7 in the evening, you put the horse away. 8, you were at supper. 9, you were asleep in your boots. Saturdays, you cleaned the machine. You greased the gears with lard or axle grease. You checked the cables for frayed spots. You filed the teeth on the pinion if they looked worn. Sundays, you rested. You went to the Lutheran church in town if the weather was fair, and you read the Bible aloud in the kitchen after supper. Mary would read Longfellow if Milner asked her. He usually asked her. And what did you do with the stumps you pulled? That's the question I kept asking the journals, because a pine stump 6 feet across and 8 feet deep, once it's out of the ground, is still a huge chunk of wood. You can't just leave it in the field. So Milner did what most farmers did. He dragged them with the horse, one at a time, to the edge of the field. He stacked them into a pile as tall as a barn. And in November, when the crop was in and the wind was right, he set the pile on fire. Those stump fires could be seen for miles. They burned for 3 or 4 days, sometimes a week if the stumps were old and dry and full of pitch. The glow on the horizon at night was a regular feature of autumn in the cutover country from the 1880s through the 1910s. A farm family down the road would see the glow and know, Milner's clearing that back 40 this year. Or, Knutson's finally getting the north field done. The smoke hung in the valleys until the first hard rain. Milner burned his first stump pile on November 14, 1890. Mary wrote in her letters to her sister back in Ohio that she had never seen her husband so tired or so quiet. He sat on the porch with a blanket over his shoulders and watched the fire until 2 in the morning. The next spring, he planted oats on the 43 acres he had cleared, and he harvested the first full, proper crop the farm had ever produced. The mortgage got paid. Mary had the baby, a girl they named Emma. Clara, Milner's sister, married a young man from a neighboring farm. The Hawkeye went to Peterson for a month, then to Knutson, then to a third neighbor named Hjalmar Thorstad, who cleared 12 acres in the fall of 1891. Thorstad's story is shorter, but I want to mention it because I found his name in the same church records as Milner's. Thorstad was 52, a widower, born in Trondheim, Norway in 1839. He had 4 grown sons who had already left for the wheat country of North Dakota. He farmed alone. He rented the Hawkeye from Milner for $3 for the month of October, pulled 412 stumps off his home field with a rented horse of his own, and in December he sold the farm to a Finnish immigrant couple and moved into a rooming house in Rice Lake, where he lived another 11 years. The Finn couple, whose name in the deed records is Saarinen, planted potatoes the following spring on the ground Thorstad had cleared. The Saarinen's grandson ran the same farm until 1974. Which is the thing I want you to hold with me for a minute. Because when you drive through Barron County, Wisconsin today, or Marquette County, Michigan, or Pine County, Minnesota, and you see those long, flat fields of corn and soybean, ringed with narrow, dark woodlots where the fence rows run, you are looking at the work of the stump puller. Every acre of that field, somebody pulled every one of those stumps. A man named Milner, or Peterson, or Knudsen, or Thorstad, with a horse, a capstan, a cable, and a summer. I want to mention one more man before I close, because his name keeps turning up in the patent records and nobody remembers him. John Milburn, not the stump puller Milburn of some other trade you may have heard of, but John Milburn of Geneva, Illinois, who in 1869 filed a patent for a capstan-type stump puller that was, as far as I can tell, the grandfather of the Hawkeye. Milburn was a machinist. He had served in an Illinois infantry regiment at Shiloh, came home with a ruined shoulder, and spent the rest of his life in a small shop making farm implements. His patent, number 95,782, describes almost exactly the mechanism Judson later commercialized as the Hawkeye. Milburn died in 1887, 3 years before Milner's Hawkeye arrived on that freight wagon. He never saw what his idea did to the cutover country. He made very little money from it. His grave is in a small country cemetery in Kane County, Illinois, and the stone is cracked down the middle. One more ask from me, and then I'll finish. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the real work, the real men, the stuff that isn't in the history books, subscribe. That's the whole pitch. I'll keep finding these stories as long as you keep telling the algorithm we want them. Here's the last thing. The thing I keep coming back to when I think about Milner and his Hawkeye and the 43 acres and the fire that burned for 4 days in November. You will be driving, some afternoon, through the cutover country of northern Wisconsin or upper Michigan. It will feel like regular farm country. Corn on one side, soybeans on the other, a silo in the middle distance, a red barn with the roof sagging a little. And you will not think for a second about what that land used to be. That field was forest once. Then it was a cutover. Then, for 20 years, it was a stump field that nobody could farm. Then a man with $85 and a horse and a machine from Burlington, Iowa, spent a summer walking in circles, one stump at a time, until every single root came up out of the ground. He burned the stumps in a pile tall as a barn. He plowed the ash into the soil. He planted oats, and his children grew up on the oats, and their children built the farmhouse that's still standing at the end of the drive. And their children sold the farm to a cousin who grows corn on it now. But the Hawkeye. Nobody remembers the Hawkeye. The machines rusted in the hay barns of the 1920s. Most of them went to scrap drives in the 2 world wars. A few survive in county historical museums, sitting in the corner with a handwritten card that says, "Stump Puller, California, 1895, donation of the Olson family." Nobody stops to read the card. Nobody knows what they did. I've stood in front of one of those machines at the Pioneer Park Museum in Rice Lake, Wisconsin. Iron frame, capstan, sweep arm, a short card in faded print. And I thought about Benjamin Milner on the 8th of May, 1890, sitting on his first pulled stump, crying, while Mary put her hand on his shoulder. I thought about Gustav Peterson bringing the smoked ham. I thought about Ola Knudson's boy riding a horse in a straight line across a field for the first time in his life. I thought about John Milburn in his Illinois shop, dying 3 years too early. 40 to 60 million acres, 100 years, one horse at a time. That was the stump puller era of American farming, 1870 to 1920. That was the work that turned the cutover into the Corn Belt. That was the last step between forest and field. I'm glad you stayed with me. Tell me in the comments if one of your own people, a grandfather, a great-grandfather, a great-aunt who remembered the stories, ever spoke of pulling stumps or of watching a stump pile burn. I read every comment. I'll see you in the next one.